Good day, and welcome to the opening panel of the FEDN conference. We're going to set the stage for today with a global conversation about democracy and markets. I'm Kim Bettcher from CIPE. I manage the Secretariat of the Free Enterprise and Democracy Network, or FEDN, and I also support international learning on policies and programs across CIPE's wider partner network. It excites me that you're here with us, the CIPE partners especially, and the FEDN members. You are the voices of change, like in the theme of this conference. And I hope you're ready to work with us to improve the ways that we make the case for freedom, for the private sector, for better governance. And if you are going to be participating in any way today, pay attention to these panelists, because they may give you ideas for your conversations later on today. Since 2008, in the past 15 years, there have been 2 global economic crises, unrelenting democratic backsliding. It is now clear that many have lost confidence in free markets and democratic institutions. This loss in confidence is associated with a combination of factors: performance challenges in political and economic systems, erosion of norms, and also the allure of competing, often authoritarian visions. Not all of us have lost confidence in the principles of freedom, but for those of us who still believe in the superiority of market principles, the rule of law, and political freedom, we must still contend with the altered landscape today, with today's altered landscape and perceptions. Make no mistake, we are looking forward to creative and constructive solutions over the next 2 days, and that's what I enjoy about the FEDN conference is people coming up with solutions. But first, we need to take stock of the trends and make sense of them, and that is why we have this opening global panel. A couple of notes: the session is being recorded, and you are able and encouraged to submit questions at any time to the panelists through the Q&A in Zoom, and that's a great way for you to participate and express what you're thinking about. All right, now to introduce our exemplary panel, who also, I would say, are voices of change. First, we have Jorge Botti, who is a serial entrepreneur in Venezuela, who has started companies in hardware, telecommunications, and consulting. He's a business leader, formerly president of Conce Comercio, the leading organization of national chambers of commerce, and FEDCámaras, Venezuela's biggest federation of business chambers. And he is, I would say, an influencer. He has a podcast, Hoja de Ruta. Next, we have Dan Negrea with us from the Atlantic Council, Senior Director of the Freedom and Prosperity Center. In his former roles, he has served the State Department in different capacities, including promoting business relations between U.S. and foreign companies and organizing the Global Entrepreneurship Summit. He has the wide variety of experience, having worked on Wall Street and also in the Ministry of Finance in communist Romania. So he has seen both sides of the equation. And we are glad to have you with us, Dan. And we have Aarya Nijat from our very own CIPE, where she is leading the CIPE South Asia program portfolio. She manages all kinds of projects with business associations, civil society organizations, and think tanks. She has extensive experience across the region. Previously, she advised on civil service reform with the University of California, San Diego. And she is an author on governance and women's leadership. And among her degrees, she has a master's from Harvard Kennedy School of Government. So welcome to the panel. All right, we're going to start our global conversation with some numbers. I would like to turn to Dan to share us some window on global trends from the last 15 years. And is there anything interconnected between the changes in the politics and the economic scene? Dan.
Thank you, Kim. Delighted to be here, and especially with the wonderful 2 other co-panelists. So I represent I'm responsible for the Freedom Prosperity Center at the Atlantic Council, and we have produced here a Freedom Index and a Prosperity Index, and we are tracking trends in freedom and prosperity over 28 years for 164 countries. And when we talk about freedom, the Freedom Index has 3 sub-indexes: economic freedom, political freedom, and legal freedom. And that's very important to keep in mind when I give you this data, because normally people, when they think of freedom, they think just about political freedom. But we also track economic freedom and legal freedom. So that's one observation. Also, the Prosperity Index has 6 indicators. Normally people, when they think of prosperity, they think of GDP per capita for a country. But we also measure education and health, the environment, inequality, and minority rights, which we measure with religious freedom. So Kim talked about backsliding and how it affected loss of confidence in the markets. What we have noticed is the start of a decline in our freedom index, again, measuring 3 things, not just political freedom, in 2012. So I'm not quibbling with the date that you picked, which is 2008. It's just that the data will take some time to reflect a certain shock to the system. So we are starting to see that event reflected in our data in 2012. And what we are seeing is a decrease in the political freedom subindex and in the legal freedom subindex, and then the next question is, did this cause a change in our prosperity index? And the answer is yes. What we saw was that in the period between 1995, when we start measuring prosperity, we saw increases every year of 0.4 points. So we measure it, we have a score that goes from 0 to 100. And they increased by 0.4 points between 1995 and 2012. But when the decrease in freedom started, the increase in subsequent years was a quarter of that, was only 0.1. So we do see this relationship, which we also see in other ways. We have, for example, we show in our report, which you can find on our website, Freedom Prosperity Center Atlantic Council. We see our report, and you see the top 30 countries in our Freedom Index. They are all prosperous. They're also at the top of the prosperity, while the countries that are at the bottom of the Freedom Index, none of them are in the top category in freedom. One more thing I would like to point out, data not from us, but from the IMF. It is very clear now that there is a decrease in the number, in the dollars and number of deals in foreign direct investment going to authoritarian countries. So the IMF produced an index that if you take 2015 first quarter as 100 as the benchmark, investments in foreign direct investment in China decreased consistently and is now less than 50%. At the same time, increases in non-China Asia, foreign direct investment actually increased recently, while investment in the US have increased. And then you also see that the investment, foreign direct investment, is going more towards countries where there is affinity geopolitically, meaning countries invest in countries that share the same values. So that's it. That's my data part, Kim.
And that's an interesting point about the investment, because there have been plenty of cases where investors have been active in authoritarian countries, but maybe the risks are shifting. Dan, one quick follow-up question. You spoke about how a shift in freedom negatively is impacting prosperity. Do you look at all at possible causality in the other direction? Could it be that economic systems that are not performing are also affecting the political freedom in some way?
Yeah, I mean, where we are very solid in our report is we show very strong correlation between freedom and prosperity. That's at 0.81. So that is without any question. In our rank tables, countries that rank highly on freedom will rank highly on prosperity. Causality, the way we are measuring causality is by looking at changes in the freedom score in 95 and the subsequent periods, and then changes in the prosperity score. So that's what the scholars call diff in diff, a difference in one and the difference in the other. And we are showing that countries that are improving their freedom tend to improve their prosperity, and countries that decrease their freedom also decrease their prosperity. The question that you are asking is, if the economic situation gets worse, is there a trend towards more authoritarian involvement? We have not studied that, so I cannot give you an answer.
Well, thanks so much, Dan, for really setting the stage and the explanation there. I'm going to turn to Jorge. First of all, Jorge, how do things look to you? Do the numbers tell a story that resonates with you? And you have seen different systems and trends, maybe some contrasts. So what interconnections have you seen?
Yes, thank you, Kim. And again, I'm really honored to be in this panel with Aarya, with Dan, who I'm just meeting virtually. I hope to meet him personally soon, and also everyone. And I have to say that basically, like you said, I am a businessman in Venezuela, doing business in Venezuela, but I am I've been very interested in trying to figure out what's going on in the world and what's going on with the democracy. I have found out initially that some authors are speaking about democracy recession and not just backsliding. So in a kind of a way, they're optimistic about maybe thinking about this process in just a recession, so democracy wave will eventually come back. I am not very sure about that, but I agree with of course, with the index and the comments of Dan, because inevitably what I see is that the trend, now that we're talking about global trends, and especially after the pandemic, tech trends, etc., the trend is to me, it's obvious. The prosperity is it's extremely linked to freedoms and to all freedoms. But on the other hand, one of the reasons I will try to focus on during this panel is trying to put a light on what the business community is doing and how it is looking at the world. So going back to dates, I was finding out that the backsliding to some according to some authors, the backsliding of democracy started earlier, around 2005 and 2006. And I know you Kim, I think you were very right trying to establish some kind of relation between the loss of confidence because of inequality, because of the lack of democracy delivering to people, being linked to the lack of confidence in markets. And to be honest, I have not yet found out a relation, that is a very linked relation. I couldn't say if the loss of confidence in markets brought us to loss of confidence on democracy, or if it worked the other way around. Of course, the far left will always say that it's always the blame of capitalism, and the global capitalism is not has created inequality, economic inequality, and economic inequality lead people to electing autocratic governments to find solutions. But I think that is a very, nuanced ways to look at the phenomenon. Just another issue I was just trying to connect with was with how much the business community is contributing or not to what's happening with the economy. And as I can see it, of course, I haven't found much studies about it. And maybe this is something we have to get much more deeper on. Sometimes it seems like the global business community is just looking other way to making business in autocratic governments and non-autocratic countries. And like we were speaking before we just started here, and you were commenting on it, Kim, somehow, especially the local business communities, the small and medium-sized communities, I'm talking specifically about Venezuela right now, are taking somehow advantage of the changes on economy, the lifting of economy regulations, specifically no price control, no exchange control anymore. And the local business community is trying to, I perceive it, and I am a critic on that. It's establishing communication with the government and just like looking the other way around on political freedom and legal freedoms. But there's the big corporate business around the world that also somehow should get involved into what's going on. And this is something I hope to develop more in the next minutes in the panel. Thank you very much.
Kim, would you like me to also reflect on this question?
Yes, thank you, Aarya. Go ahead.
Of course. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be on this panel with Dan and Jorge, and it's wonderful to meet you. And this is an important question, Kim, I think, and this is a question, the correlation. This is also a question that I think goes to the heart of the foundational principles of both CIPE and FEDN. I think democratic backsliding is in a mutually reinforcing relation with loss of confidence in markets, because there is an interrelation between democracy and market economy. And I think that's undeniable. I mean, openness, competition, and choice are shared attributes of both market economies and democracies. What safeguards political competition and individual rights politically, rule of law, also facilitates the functioning of market economies, and democracy as a system of governance, I think, is both a goal, but also a means for creating conducive business environment. And it enhances economic policy making through participation and representation and feedback, which is at the heart of what CIPE does through private sector engagement. And private sector's active participation in policy discussions brings new ideas and adds independent voices to reform initiatives, and it kind of broadens the support base for democracy. So to me, it's a given. To me, it's obvious that the loss of one will weaken the other. Now, to respond to your question, I want to highlight one of the aspects of it that I sometimes feel it's obvious, it's very important, but it may get overlooked in the bigger scheme of things and in the bigger discussions that we have, and that's how it affects people and in return influences their decision-making patterns, which affects the state of democracy in different countries, where we see the impact of this interrelation in mutual influencing. And it's important because how people react and respond to these dynamics of loss creates opportunities which are open to manipulation, but also open to exploration, depending on who's doing it. For instance, when we go back to the 2008 financial crisis, and I really liked what Dan said about it takes a couple of years for the shock waves to assert itself and show itself in data. At the time, people were profoundly affected, loss of income opportunities, loss of shelter, and overall loss of access to economic opportunities. It led to their erosion of trust in institutions, and a disillusionment with mainstream political and financial institutions. And if you recall, some of the countries at the time introduced austerity measures to address the situation, some of which included cuts, for instance, to public spending or increase in taxes, which furthered people's loss because they thought that they are bearing the burden of the economic crisis, while the financial institutions that in their eyes were responsible remain untouched. India, for instance, I remember introduced stimulus packages and implemented pro-market economic reforms, but even that led to debates about the rise of inequality and how it affected marginalized populations. So even those policies that apparently were pro-market indirectly strengthened the perception that the political elite and the economic elite were too aligned with each other, and it furthered that disillusionment. Now, coming back to the point that I want to make, I think it's the public disillusionment that contributed to the rise of populist movements and the backsliding of democracy. And it gave populist leaders the opportunity to come and frame their policies, which were diverging from market-friendly approaches, as solutions to economic insecurity. And some of those policies were advocated for economic protectionism or a more interventionist government role in markets. In the case of South Asia, what the example that comes to mind is the re-election of Mahinda Rajapaksa in early 2010, and that was followed by a landslide victory, parliamentary victory the same year. Now, obviously, Sri Lanka had other factors as well driving this change. There were security considerations, there was the defeat of the Tamil Tigers, but I cannot refute how global events impacted domestic dynamics within that country. And on the flip side, and I will end with this point, is the same populist leaders, such as the one in Sri Lanka, that came with the promise of change through mechanisms enabled by democracy, which are also called opportunistic autocrats. They adopted policies that undermined democratic norms and institutions, for instance, curtailed the independence of the judiciary or restricted freedom of media. Now, these together then affect the markets because they create uncertainty for investors and just overall a weak business environment. When you combine a weak rule of law with concentration of power in the hands of a few, in the case of Sri Lanka, it was in the hands of one family, it leads to concerns about the business environment and overall certainty for investors. And you add to that untransparent and unaccountable public financial management, and what you get is the crisis that Sri Lanka is still trying to come out of.
Yeah.
Well, Aarya, it's often not easy to link conversations at like the regional level, South Asia with global. You've done that very coherently, and from what Jorge was saying, it sounds like there are some serious trends, but there may be different factors involved. We need to be careful with our assumptions, and perhaps I'm hearing that the writing is not yet on the wall, that how we respond to different factors may make some difference. Now, everyone who's participating, please do submit a question through the Q&A feature in Zoom. I'm sure that it would really make the panelists feel good, and it would make you feel good. So, and it would kind of reduce my hegemony in asking the questions here. All right, so Jorge, I'd like to come back to you now with another question about what are some of the opportunities to pivot or to renovate political and economic systems? You know, is there some sense of agency? And I wonder, if we stick to our principles, is that putting in our heads in the sand, or is that a good thing?
That is a great topic to discuss, Kim. And I've been thinking the last days about how to manage some kind of response specifically in the region or in a specific country, or trying to establish a global trend in order to influence through political leaders or through organizations like chambers of commerce on how to deal with this. the first thing I'd like to say, it's very important to try to strengthen countervailing institutions, and not only political institution. I know it's not easy. I mean, you cannot ask Nicaragua leader or Maduro here in Venezuela or any autocrat in the world to establish rule of law and balance of power and trying to solidify or strengthen institutions. But we can manage to strengthen civil institutions, business chambers, ONGs, even religious institutions, which are very have a lot of influence, specifically in Latin America. That is why, just as an example, the Nicaragua dictator Noriega just is wiping out all the religious leaders in the country. But I think that's one way to go. And on the other hand, I think we have to find a way, Kim, to influence corporate decisions. I mean, the global corporations. I'm not talking about, I mean, you previously said like get out of Russia or get out of China, all investments. That's not going to happen that easily. But one of the questions I keep asking myself, and we were talking about just minutes ago regarding specifically about sanctions. Are we is trying to establish more open market economies in autocratic countries a better way to go in order to wish for the comeback of democracy, or is it a better way to go? Trying to sanction and to close the economy and to make the population suffer. And I don't have an answer for that. I believe, and I've been reading about it, that as long as we have more open markets, and I have to quote on that, it's not some of what's going on. It's not like in Venezuela or in other places. It's not a free market economy. We don't have any more regulations like we had 5 years ago. And a new investment has come in, but it's not enough. But we don't have to fool ourselves. This is crony capitalism. It is not open market. So with just what Aida was telling about Sri Lanka and other countries, just one or two families dominate it all. But if we want to keep the light of the beacon of free market and democracy on, I think the best way to go is to try to keep the markets open. That is my approach on this. And as I said sometime, and I close with this remark, as I said sometime, I think it was last year, in a few private meetings and also some seminars like this, as a businessman and as a Venezuelan citizen, I much rather wait and fight for the return of political and legal freedoms accompanied by Western capitals than from capitals from Iran and Russia and China taking over the Venezuelan economy. That is something I think we have to deeply think about.
Thank you, Jorge. I know you're making me think, and I appreciate your pointing out that we should not mistake crony capitalism for open markets. Dan, I know that you look at the principles and the data from your experience. Do you see opportunities to renovate systems, to reinvigorate freedom?
Yes, at the point I would like to make, and then I would love to comment very briefly on Jorge's question. I would like to propose a geostrategic framework for our discussion. We produced a paper recently at our center where we started by looking at the world at the time the Berlin Wall fell. And at that time, Francis Fukuyama at Stanford declared the end of history. He said, obviously, nobody in the world could possibly think about any other form of government than democracy and any other way of organizing markets than free markets. And then we look at where we are now 30 years later, And according to our indexes, only 14% of the people of the world live in countries that are in the free category of our freedom index. So clearly, there isn't a global consensus on development models. And the two so it's important to recognize that there are two important proponents of the autocratic development model, and these are Russia and China. And in our study, what we did was we showed how comparing the Russian Federation with Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia is a useful exercise, because all these countries were part of the Soviet Union. So 30 years ago, they had no economic freedom, no political freedom, no legal freedom. But subsequently, they chose different paths. Russia is authoritarian, the Baltics are free countries. The prosperity score of the Baltics far exceeds the Russians. And if you look at the middle income trap of the World Bank, Russia is still in the middle income trap while the Baltics escaped. And then we looked in the case of China, we compared China with South Korea and Taiwan. What they had in common, we looked at the early 60s, was they were all very poor. In terms of GDP per capita, they were comparable, and they were all dictatorships, military dictatorships in Taiwan and South Korea, communist dictatorships in China. In the 90s, early 90s, South Korea and Taiwan chose freedom politically. They had economic freedom and legal freedom before. And then you see them taking off and vastly exceeding where the People's Republic of China is, which is still caught in the middle income trap. So I think that we need to, number one, recognize that there is this, there are blocks forming, groupings of countries, the authoritarian countries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, advocating for an authoritarian form of development. There is a free world, North America, Europe, Japan, Australia, and so on. And then there are a lot of countries, sort of a revival of the non-aligned movement. Some people call them swing countries, that claim that they don't want to take sides. And we need to make the case to these countries that the path forward is development. The path forward for development is freedom. Very briefly on Jorge's question on sanctions, I agree with your question that you put it, and the way you put it, to say we need to think about it. The argument for sanctions that I would make is twofold, and I understand all your concerns. I'm not dismissing them. Two arguments for your consideration and for our audience's consideration. Number one, people in free countries want to say something about obvious and revolting abuses to freedom. And what can they say? One choice is military intervention, and that's extreme, and we want to keep that for extraordinary circumstances. And then the next best thing, the only other thing, is sanctions. And then the question that you raise is, well, you put in sanctions and you bring in the bad guys to do business there. So what have you accomplished? Well, at least what you've accomplished is to make it harder for the authoritarians in power to show that their system works. I remember when sanctions were put on Iran, the Iranian currency lost 75% of its value. So then they can't go, the mullahs can't go around to their people, say, listen, our system works. No, it doesn't work. You have inflation. So just for your consideration, Jorge, and for the audience to consider. Thank you.
All right, I am going to take a question from the Q&A chat. This is coming from Nepal, from Arpita, Nepal. And Nepal we can characterize as a developing economy and a new democracy. And the question is about development assistance and what its role may be here. And specifically, two concerns. She is asking, can development assistance push its own agendas in developing countries and thereby subvert freedom of speech? And also another concern, does development aid negate accountability between the electorate and the elected in countries receiving aid? So is development assistance challenging to democracy and its development in nascent democracies? Who would like to take a try at answering this question?
Well, I can tell you I've thought a lot about it because I worked at the State Department, and also I'm thinking about what the US should do afterwards. Two observations. In terms of development assistance, I think it's fair to say that neither the Democrats or the Republicans in the United States have an appetite for more grants and for more access, preferential access to the US market. So then if the US will give less money and less trade preferences, what is it giving? And what the US is giving is advice on how countries can create an environment in which the local business will flourish. So I agree with the question from Nepal that development assistance may be a problem, that it may discourage local development, it may distort conditions in that particular country. And it has to be well targeted. But I think that we are going to see less of it the old way and more of it in another way, which is more of an enabling environment and telling countries how they can create an environment where corporations rather than government money will come, where corporations will come in because the environment of economic freedom, legal freedom, political is welcoming to foreign direct investment. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to respond?
I can also thank you so much, Arpita, for your question. And I think it's a very important question. And I understand where you're coming from because I have also been on the receiving side of, so to say, development assistance and how it's received and how it's then implemented by local organizations. I think it's a given that every intervention comes with a purpose. There is a goal behind it. So we should begin with that assumption. But it takes two to tango, as they say. And what I mean by that is for development assistance to be truly meaningful in supporting local agency in different countries, such as in Nepal, it takes both responsible listening on the part of the development organization that is providing the assistance, whether technical or financial, but it also takes leadership in initiative taking on the part of local organizations, civil society organizations, private sector in country to take that leadership role. I think where things go wrong is when there is dependence, both financially and technically, on the knowledge and understanding of an outsider organization coming to a country like Nepal. When you rely on that technical expertise, then things go wrong. But if local organizations believe in themselves and take leadership, I think the tables can turn. And I've seen that happen in the work that we do in Nepal. And I also see another question from another partner organization of CIPE here. So we see that in practice in the way CIPE works by insisting on the principle of local ownership, by insisting on a very basic principle that we don't design projects sitting here in DC. What programs are should be implemented, what are priorities for the people of Nepal, for the private sector of Nepal, and what approaches should be taken. They always come from the partners. And so knowing that facilitating supportive role of development agencies and supporting that leadership role of local agencies is, I think, at the heart of your question, because otherwise, yes, every intervention comes with a purpose.
Yeah. Kim, just a brief remark. I think that both interventions are very complete, but I think when we talk about development assistance, maybe we are coming into some sort of paradox, like in the sanctions we were talking before. There's two sides of it. And I agree with the previous comment about when Dan was pointing out on how closing a nation and sanctioning it takes away money from the autocracy to perform well. And that is also correct. I would like to point out specifically the example of what's going on right now in Venezuela. We had a lot of humanitarian assistance, and now we're starting to talk about development assistance. We're talking about trying to lift the electrical power system in Venezuela or the water system in Venezuela. And then, and it's starting to happen. It's specifically, I think the next coming months we're going to see a lot of development assistance coming into Venezuela for public services, for example. And again, this is some kind of paradox. Is that going to benefit Maduro at the end of the day? Is that going to benefit the autocrat? Is that going to benefit the people? So I don't think there's an answer, a clear answer for this. And at the end of the day, I think, when the autocrats take a grip on power, and the global powers tend to see that there's no way to change that in the short time, then these questions arrive, and I think it's just a paradox. They don't have answer yet.
All right. Well, let me see if I can try to stir things up a little bit just by bringing out different perspectives. And we're all complex individuals, and you're all experts. But maybe I could ask you to come at the question of change and the challenges to change from like a business and a civil society and a policy perspective. If that's okay for you to play that role for a moment. So Jorge, I'll start with you. I don't imagine business and civil society agree all the time on how to reform markets or democracy. Do you see that?
That is a great topic to discuss about. And again, I have to talk about what I know, which is Venezuela and the region, what's going on in the region. The first thing I'd like to say, I do not tend to agree on the fact that the whole Latin America is turning backwards to democracy. That is happening in Salvador, which is a right-wing autocrat that is more and more taking away some freedoms. And we have Nicaragua and of course Venezuela. But there's a new leftish kind of governments in Colombia and Chile, in Lula back again in Brazil. And those are not, I don't see a trend towards autocracy in that new wave of leftish governments in the region. On the other hand, opposed to that, I think they're trying to manage some kind of, I don't know how to say that word in English, alicate. I'm a business in a hardware, so it's a kind of a plier, to apply a political plier on Nicaragua and on Venezuela in order for the autocrats, maybe not to go away from power, but to open again to more democratic spaces and to start some kind of slow transition. Business organizations, at least in Venezuela, and I think in the region, I think they're somehow looking away and trying to do business as possible. Civil society, on the other hand, is making a lot of struggle and trying to influence the economic changes. And I think there is no communication on how to approach market reforms, Kim. I mean, at least I don't see any. There's not a lot of discussion about that point. I mean, apparently nobody is against open markets and free economy. We're not looking at that in the region, and specifically in Venezuela. But I do think, and that we have to remember that even though we have a very hardball autocrats, especially in Nicaragua, these are new kind of autocracies. There are elections. And if we can manage through civil organizations, through business organizations, and through political parties that are still trying to fight against autocrats, to manage to convince the most of the majority when the election time comes, I think we can manage some change. Not just because we can win an election, but we can make pressure, a huge and very strong political pressure to make autocrats swift or change, at least do small changes towards keeping at least some kind of democracy or democracy guarantees open. And just as an example, we have upcoming elections next year. I think something's going to happen like that in Venezuela. But not only the presidential election, we have a new parliament election in the year 2025. And that could be the epicenter or the cradle of making some kind of transition, which is, as usual, is a transition closer to the power at hand, and not just to break the power and to establish democracy 100% one day after another. It's going to be a small not small, it's a slow process that I think we have to approach, and I think civil organizations can do very much about it.
All right, so the autocratic challenge can come from the right or from the left, and at least some in business like yourself are seeing the leadership role that civic organizations can play. Aarya, if you look at it from the civic perspective, or maybe some of the civic organizations that you work with, how do they see the prospects for reform, maybe in contraposition to how a business view might be?
Before answering that question, Kim, if I can briefly just touch on what Dan said, because that's an issue we deal with repeatedly in the context of South Asia. You mentioned the non-aligned movement, the countries that do not take sides. What we have learned over the course of the years working in South Asia is that in South Asia, the non-alignment is a value. It's seen as a sign of mature diplomacy to not be aligned. And so the transition that we would be encouraging is a value transition, which, as you would know, is harder because it's it's deeper in the system of how the countries and how the systems operate in South Asia. And now coming to your question about how civil society would see it, Kim, something that we grapple with in the context of South Asia, and I think civil society increasingly is dealing with, is the question of how to adapt to the changing environment for the work of democracy. And by that change, I mean the profound ways in which technology is affecting the pace, speed, and nature of access to information in the region. And one of the challenges that civil society has is how to adapt to this fast, constantly changing dynamic. And it's also a challenge because there's also a trap. It's easy to think that one can or perhaps should resist this technology-enabled approach to work, because we also see the abuse of technology, we see the spread of disinformation or cyber attacks and erosion of privacy, or just overall concerns about ethics and technology. But that's the exact opposite. So this is one of the challenges that at least in the context of South Asia, civil society is on a day-to-day basis dealing with and trying to find ways of adapting to it. But there's also more. It also feels sometimes that the scope of sciences that inform this process of responding to democratic backsliding or working to support democratic institutions and countries, the scope of sciences that support that, such as political science or economic studies, or even holistic sciences like anthropology, they're falling short. In that there may be need for a more interdisciplinary approach. For instance, I mean, something that has been fascinating us is how neuroendocrinology can provide information, because it helps you understand how the brain reacts in exchange to in the absence of or in the presence of new information given. And this is very important, and it goes back to the point that I earlier made about people's agency, because technology is a strong enabler. We know that it enables participation, it improves transparency, but at the same time, something that is becoming more and more, and it's a conversation that we have with partners, is more and more important, is it's wanting to enable dialogue and information sharing through public-private dialogues, through civil society private dialogues, and it's another to give a direction. And the challenge that civil society has is they don't want to act like a populist leader and lose humility and offer solutions. They want to be on the fringes, they want to support, they want to provide information, but remain non-aligned, but let others make the decision. But I think it's a little more than that. There's need for increased and intentional agency by offering direction in order to counter the manipulation that comes from it. So one of the other challenges a civil society has is how to go beyond just non-aligned facilitation of democratic dialogue, while at the same time allowing for ideas and innovation to come through.
If I keep with this question of agency and engagement, Dan, I admit I need to go back and take another fresh look at the Freedom and Prosperity Index. There's always something more to explore in there, but either from the index or your policy experience, do you see anything about what's important in civic engagement or the private sector role in sustaining or reforming systems for freedom?
Yeah, so coming back to what Aarya is saying, she's right. There are countries that make a virtue out of non-alignment, for example, India and many others. But this in itself, in this dialogue that we are having here today, is a problem, because there is this incomprehension between what I will call the free world. A lot of terminology from the Cold War is coming back. Some people talk about a new Cold War. So we have again a free world, we have an authoritarian bloc, and we have non-aligned world. The free world is saying Russia invades Ukraine in clear violation of a principal tenet of the United Nations. How can you be non-aligned to that? And a non-aligned country says, well, yeah, it's not good, but I'm not getting too excited. Well, you should get excited. A country is being invaded. They bombed maternity yards. I mean, it's horrendous. And they say, well, leave me alone. Okay, fine. The other thing on this non-alignment, leave me alone, I'll do it my way, is Xi Jinping famously said recently, you don't need to westernize to modernize. Meaning, I don't need to have freedom and democracy in order to have economic growth in my country. I just came back from Bangladesh, and many interviews with the press there, they were saying the motto of the government is development first, democracy later. And, you know, the Westerners say you need democracy first and then development will follow. There is a value difference that we either believe in our values or we don't, and we should not be shy in putting them forward if we feel strongly that it's the right solution for development.
Excellent. Well, we have about 5 minutes left in our discussion. I have another question I'll take from the chat, and then I would ask all three of the speakers to respond to the question if you like, and in any case, very briefly, give us one recommendation or one point to keep in mind in our continuing conference. So there is a question about how is it that a majority of voters in some countries with relatively free elections like Hungary and Turkey seem to prefer strong men leaders. So how is that? How do we think about voters preferring alternative visions to democracy? So something to think about, but in any case, I would like to hear a response to that or to your final recommendation. And Aarya, how about you?
Thank you, Kim. I think I will stick with responding to the one recommendation. I feel very strongly about that. I think one thing to understand, because in my previous answer, I talked about the need to transition, the need to kind of understand the space and age that we are in. One thing to remember is the basics as we go through adapting to the technology age, as we go through innovative ways of dealing with democratic backsliding and the way that it affects political rights or markets. I think remembering the basics and sticking to them would be very important. For instance, fostering civic education and engagement will continue to remain a priority and should remain a priority, because without understanding of how democratic systems or market economies operate, effective participation in them will not be possible. Or doubling down on supporting civil society and private sector should remain a priority, because regardless of motivations or methods of democratic backsliding, a focus always remains on undermining institutions that keep a check on the big leaders, on people on positions of power. So what's important to remember is the future is going to be a dance between constant transition and constant maintaining of what matters. Being open to this dance is very important in my view, and being open, building systems, whether it's at an organization's level or at a society's level, building systems in a way that allows for these contradictory forces of transition and maintenance to live together and coexist together would be very, very important to remember. And I will end with that. Thank you so much.
Wow. Dan, a minute for your final thought.
Yeah, I will follow Aarya. I'm copying Aarya in almost everything. So I'll copy Aarya and not answer the question, or rather, let me answer the question in 1 minute. There were specific conditions in Turkey and in Hungary that are very different, that explain the vote for Erdogan and for the Hungarian leader. But on the recommendation, it's education. We need to explain to people that the path for successful development is by way of freedom. But if we are going to educate, we need to be firm in our beliefs that our values are the right ones. So let's not be shy about standing up for what we believe is right and promote education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And Jorge, last word.
Yes, thank you, Kim. It's an honor to be here again and to learn about these topics. I totally agree with Dan. I think we have to stick with our and fight for our way of thinking. I think education is key. And to very quickly answer the question, most of autocratic countries right now do have elections. They are somehow not very clean elections, but they do have elections. Just as an example, Mr. Chavez was unequivocally the most popular guy for 20 years or so. The first time we're going to go to an election, which is clearly the other way around, around 70% of the people, 80% of the people want to change, will be next year. So I think through education, through political leaders, through business leaders, through civil society, there is always a way to communicate with the basic people that are going to vote and create a new environment. Of course, this is a big issue because if you take elections right now in Salvador, Mr. Bukele will get 80% of the votes. But it would not necessarily be that way. I mean, if Salvadorians are willingly giving away their freedoms, their legal freedoms, their political freedoms, in exchange of security, of feeling safe. That is what Mr. Bukele is offering right now. But it's that, I have to say, by final words, like quoting Mr. Dan and Dan Negrea in his studies, there is no development model in autocracies. It would never work. We have to stick to freedom.
Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate all the wisdom, the new questions, the call for agency, while reflecting the facts and sustaining the values. I really appreciate the insights. I want our virtual panel to please join me in thanking our exceptional panelists, and do stay for the breakout sessions where you can go deeper, get more involved in these questions. Thank you.